Welcome to the Trad Dads podcast, where we examine cultural and political issues through the lens of traditional thought.
All right, this week I wanted to share another reading of Father Heinrich Pesch's book, Ethics and the National Economy. So here you go. Ethics and the National Economy by Father Heinrich Pesch, published by IHS Press, 2004. Chapter 2, The State and the National Economy, the Purpose and Unity of the National Economy. Christian philosophy rejects Rousseau's attempt to trace the origin of the state and its authority to a social contract, even when that is understood in the sense of an idealized construct rather than as a genuine historic genetic origin. Actually, the state is based on a far more solid foundation. The individual state is, as a matter of fact, the direct product of history. However, that ever-recurrent development toward a political society and toward the state itself would remain inexplicable if we did not go back to causes which go beyond the merely historic ones which give rise to specific individual states, namely to universal needs that abide in human nature. Man, being who he is, requires other social ties aside from family and other narrower societal forms growing out of the family in order to develop fully and to secure a dignified human mode of existence. It is his social nature, with its capacity and need for fulfillment, which directs him time and again to move beyond the family toward that more powerful and more comprehensive higher association, the state. For it is by the state that he achieves all of those temporal human objectives which would be unattainable without it. That which constitutes the basis for its existence and the actual coming into being of the society which we call the state, in turn, also designates and sets limits to the state's purpose. The state is supposed to do for its members what they, by their own personal capabilities and by the capacities of lower-ranking societies within the state, cannot accomplish. And that includes the orderly and assured protection of their rights, effective assistance, and seeing that their shortcomings are complemented by the power which citizens of a state have when they act in concert. Briefly, then, the purpose of the state consists in providing, safeguarding, and complementing the sum of those social conditions, institutions, and structures which alone provide and preserve for all members of the state the fuller capacities to secure and maintain their temporal welfare on their own and by using their own abilities. Direct procurement of the welfare of private individuals by the state becomes legitimate only in exceptional cases where other appropriate aids designed for that purpose are lacking or inadequate. Then involvement by the state becomes necessary for the orderly, effective prevention of misery and poverty among persons who are unable to help themselves. The particular reason for the existence of public authorities as well as the establishment and limitation of their powers also lies in this ultimate purpose of the state. The authority of the state does not exist for its own sake, but for the sake of political society, and it is morally obligated by legal justice to fulfill that purpose for which the state exists, just as legal justice, by the same token, obliges the citizen to obey and to subordinate his private interests to the common interests of the state. Therefore, public authority must, first of all, move effectively to establish the prerequisites of the public welfare. That includes concern for the survival, the unity, and the power of the state, protection against external enemies and internal rebellion, and for the kind of representation in dealing with foreign countries and other regions, which is of great economic importance. Accordingly, state authority is there to protect the rights of its citizens, but also interests of the community against all egotistical endeavors which cannot be reconciled with the civil common good. Thus it also exists to safeguard the rights of the community against private interests which conflict with it wherever other kinds of regulation cannot accomplish that. The purpose of state authority is, however, by no means merely negative or repressive, and its functions are not exhausted in protecting the rights of individuals and the well-being of the community against incursions. It also has the right and the obligation to promote this well-being positively and without harming the initiative of its citizens, to rally all social energies to cooperate positively in establishing and fostering the public welfare. Particular historic circumstances and needs can determine these generally acknowledged functions of state authority, more specifically in certain cases. Thus, in our time, it is regarded as incumbent on the state authorities to cooperate in eliminating certain great social and economic evils
which have resulted during the course of recent history. We refer on the one hand to a progressive accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few, while the rest of the nation is increasingly proletarianized. And on the other hand, there are the special dangers to which proletarianized masses become subject, because of their dependence on the classes which own the wealth. And the still viable middle class also requires care and assistance so that it can maintain its independence, and so that the ways to acquire wealth are not everywhere closed to it. Therefore, it is now up to the state authorities to be specially careful to protect effectively the masses which have already been proletarianized in their rights as human beings, Christians and citizens, and to promote all endeavors which can help to alleviate the problems which already exist in this area. Benjamin Kidd attributes the victorious advance of the labor movement in England to the centuries-long impact of the Christian religion, which has penetrated the depths of conscience and has therefore also permeated all of literature, so that the cry of the lower classes for human dignity and equal rights has come to be associated with the noblest and deep-seated convictions of all decent people. Whether or not that may be the case, any authentic social policy which is to achieve not merely a temporary rise to power by one class, but which is directed also to elevating the relationships among the various interest groups to a level of social reciprocity and genuine vital community on a permanent basis, will find firm and basic support in the Christian principle of solidarity, of cooperation in the common obligation to the purpose for which the state exists. In other words, in the solidaristic responsibility of all for the common good of the nation. Distributive justice excludes all arbitrariness of the part of state authorities in the manner in which they distribute public benefits and responsibilities. Benefits must be distributed on the basis of what is merited and what is needed. It was in accord with that principle that Leo XIII in the encyclical Rerum Novarum called for special protection for the working class. On the one hand, responsibilities are also to be distributed on the basis of ability. So far as their tax burdens are concerned, individual citizens do not have simply a kind of exchange relationship with the state, as if their tax burden were to be determined according to the benefits which each citizen derives from the state, in accord with the liberal theory of respective interests and of insurance. No, there is a genuine obligation to pay taxes, which is not based on particular benefits received by the individual from the state, but on the fact that the person is a member of the political body. In our time especially, faced with the need to distribute ever-increasing burdens and the efforts to acquire new sources of income by increasing state ownership, a direction which may become even more prevalent after the war, the state must also take care to avoid any kind of injustice against individuals and individual economic units, but also against entire groups of business interests and occupational groups in the economy, so that the eventual harm to the whole national economy would be out of proportion to whatever material advantage the state could possibly gain. One may continue to note the advantages of monarchy without seeing democracy as the apex of godlessness. In any case, it is not possible to make a case for a particular form of state or government, any more than it is possible to derive the need for some particular kind of economic system from the Christian religion. However, for all forms of states and governments, the purpose of the state adds up to a kind of imperative, which is binding on the wills of all members of the state, citizens as well as public authorities, just as there arise from it important moral obligations in the economic area. In all cases, the citizen must subordinate his private interests to the interests of the community in accord with the principle of conflicting rights. He must assume his share of the common burden according to the measure of his capacities, and he must obey rules of legitimate authorities which are laid down with a view to the well-being of the whole community. On the other hand, state authorities are obliged to uphold the common good of the community to the best of its knowledge and abilities. There is no room here for the concept of a night watchman state, for a purely utilitarian economic kind of state which has as its sole purpose to protect the liberties of self-seeking contenders and the property of the kind of two-legged creatures who have no higher goal in life than to buy as cheaply as possible and to sell at the highest possible price. But there is also no room for absolutism on the part of the state authorities. The right of the state extends no further than its purpose. Within the state, there persists a sphere of inviolate individual freedom, not only where the highest rights of a morally free person are concerned, but even where we are dealing with the most intimate affairs, individual aims and activities in the economic area, so long as these do not go against the general public welfare. The power of the state may limit freedom where it is necessary to achieve the state's ultimate purpose, but it may never annihilate freedom. The recognition of moral forces which bind the arbitrary will of the state is the first step away from state absolutism, and it is that recognition which sets it apart from despotism. Second, and no less important, is recognition of rights which are independent of any arbitrary power. And finally, there is the fact that public actions by state authority are also bound by certain rules, and a recognition that public law is a norm which is independent of discretionary power on the part of public authorities. This is how George V. Herding resolved the antithesis of might and right, and of force and freedom in terms of a synthesis established on the basis of morality. Christianity clothed temporal with true authority, but at the same time it made it responsible to God as the protector of justice and of the socio-political common good. Once again, it was the Christian religion which was responsible for breaking down despotism, just as it was the bulwark of true civil liberty by virtue of its doctrine about the eternal destiny of man, which transcends the political sphere, and to which all temporal striving and actions must be directed. Also by its teaching about a kind of law, which the state was not the source of, and about a kind of justice, which went beyond political legislation, providing the yardstick for such legislation, and the only secure foundation for political life, and also about natural and supernatural forms of society. The family and the church, which did not receive and do not derive their right to exist or their goals from the largesse of temporal powers. In other words, the social life of human beings is not exhausted solely and exclusively in their being members of the state. It is possible, therefore, to derive the most important principles for judging and structuring economic life and the state's concerns about economic life in a national community that is united into a political state from Christian political philosophy and ethics. The national economy cannot be regarded as simply the sum of individual economic units whose only bond is the contractual relations which they enter into with each other, any more than the state is a mere sum of citizen atoms. Instead, the national economy is a unit bound together by moral bonds, not in such a way as the national community or the state turns out to be the subject of the economic process, but because the citizens, insofar as their economic activities are concerned, are also subordinate to the purposes of the state, so that they too must serve the general welfare which is common to all. This kind of unity does not do away with the economic independence of the individual economic units in the sense that communism or state socialism would. It does not eliminate the plurality of economies. The state does not become coextensive with society, and it does not suppress individual activity by its citizens and the activities of organizations of citizens in the economic area. Socialization is not justified by mere fact that it appears to be technically and economically possible and operable. It must also be shown to be financially or economically necessary in each individual case. As Schaffel put it, let us have an expanded economic policy, but state operation of economic units only in exceptional cases. Briefly, then, the independence and autonomy of individual economic units must continue. However, the national economy turns the plurality of such economic units into a genuine social unit by the purpose which all citizens must cooperate in achieving. The economizing human person is a citizen of the state, and he continues to be one also when he acts as an economizing person. Even in international economic relations which extend beyond the boundaries of the state, he is not a world citizen who has no responsibilities to the state. If to economize means to work at providing material goods for the satisfaction of human wants, then it is the task of the national economy as a social unit, controlled by the purposes for which the state exists, to achieve the kind of satisfaction of the nation's wants, which is in accord with the given cultural level, and which can be regarded in this sense as national wealth, stemming from the public welfare and the actions of its citizens. The organic concept acknowledges that the state has certain tasks which are peculiar to it and transcend the individuals who make up the state. Thus, the national economic purpose also rises above the subjective purposes of economic individuals, but it does not push aside and suppress those purposes so long as they are in harmony with the national economic purpose. For just as the state is not a physical organism where the members are merely members and nothing more, without any degree of autonomy and independence of their own, the unity of the national economy also has the same moral organic character. Citizens engaged in economic activity do not serve only the common purpose. They also have their own purposes. They remain free human beings, and their freedom actually has its best guarantee in the fact that such freedom is not absolute for any individual, and because it finds itself limited by the legitimate claims and interests of one's fellow citizens, just as political civil liberty is limited by the purposes of the national community organized in the form of a political state. The integral concept of the community as a moral organism also normally includes, along with unity and order, some social satisfaction. The integral concept of the community as a moral organism also normally includes, along with unity and order, some social stratification. Doing the same kind of work or being involved in the same occupation constitutes the inner unifying bond for organizations which turn out to be organs of the social body overall, and whose operative accomplishment emerges as a social function by virtue of the role they play in satisfying people's wants. A corporate structure that is based on such unifying bonds does not constitute a state within a state. The overall general interest of society transcends group interests, and it is promoted and preserved once again by the higher requisite solidarity of the national economic and political community, and safeguarded by regulative and harmonizing action on the part of public authorities. However, the vocational occupational concept, the idea of service to the whole, as it is understood here, serves to strengthen the national economic community. The class concept, on the other hand, which is based solely on how much property people own, taken by itself, tears apart the social fabric, inasmuch as it injects parties even in the economic area, where there should be organs. In the approach we are following here, which is based on morality and moral obligations, the purpose of the national economy is this: meeting the national need for material goods within the context of the general welfare, with regulating factors including the consciences of human beings who are fallible, even in the best political and economic orders, along with civil organizations which perform their functions in a conscientious manner, and finally, the complementary, harmonizing, and regulative activity of state authorities. And according to our approach, the notion of community, which found such clear expression during the World War, has its firm support in God and the will of God, on which order in the world is ultimately based. An altogether different foundation than capricious human thoughts and sentiments, patriotic enthusiasm, or constantly changing extrinsic circumstances. We see individuals as not simply left free to follow their own self-centered inclinations, but as bound together with the whole community by obligations and mutual concern for one another, and assisting one another. While the community is seen as something that has great value on its own merits, which transcends the individuals not merely because of its power, but by virtue of its place in the moral order and the purpose which it accomplishes. If, on the other hand, the nation and the state are nothing more than a sum of all individuals, then, as Otto Gierke said, the glitter of an exalted moral idea pales into insignificance, and that kind of development has always prefigured the death of the fatherland. Indeed, why should any individual want to sacrifice himself for the well-being of many others who are actually no different from himself? We have a commandment which governs the conduct of one individual toward another. Love thy neighbor as thyself. It is on this commandment that extreme individualists like Tolstoy, with all good intentions, want to base the life of human society. And take note, they are people who would demolish the state and who preach anarchy. The religious complement which goes along with the commandment to love one's neighbor is to be found in the law. Love God above all else. That is the commandment which builds the kingdom of God. That is not of this world. But even for the temporal community, we are saying here, in keeping with God's law, love the whole more than you love yourself, and that only makes sense if the whole is something more exalted and precious than the mere sum of many individuals. Let us turn our attention now to the national economic process of satisfying the need for material goods. Chapter 3. Human Wants and the Economy. The Creator assigned to man dominion over this world. He was to be its Lord and Master. The fact that we have such dominion over the world is obvious. Every kind of progress in the area of material culture affirms it. Its foundation, however, is in the will of God, who assigned that dominion to the first father of our race, and who endowed him with a rational nature which provided him with the essential supremacy over mere matter. Furthermore, the foundations of that dominion are unalterable. It is only the specific manner in which it finds its concrete expression which can change. Insofar as its essential components are concerned, rational human nature is a work of creation and not of history. Everywhere and at all times, man continues to be made up of body and soul, and he remains always and everywhere an intelligent, rational being. However, the particular strengths and qualities enclosed in his essence are like seeds which have the potential and need for development. They are influenced in their development and fulfillment by extrinsic conditions and changing circumstances. In particular, the way in which this actually takes place, the specific form and concrete structure of the way in which man exercises dominion over the physical universe evolves in a long, ongoing process, and it moves forward unsteadily, starting from the individual struggle for subsistence by primitive people and progressing to the highest form of culture, which involve a well-developed dominion over our environment. Human nature persists, and its persistence is its activity, its unfolding is associated with a rich measure of modification, alteration, growth, and eventually decomposition. Along with what is general, there is also what is particular. Along with what is natural and persistent, there is also the transitory and the historic. And along with what always and everywhere preserves its genuineness, its propriety, and its validity, there are also those things which are valid and proper and effective only in particular historical circumstances. No economic order or economic form or economic system is intended for all ages. For that reason, neither can Christian ethics associate itself with one particular economic system. It is adaptable to every historic structure in which its principles and requirements are preserved intact. Rational nature is the common property of all persons. And it is for that reason that all people are also called, in one way or another, to share in man's dominion, which is based on human nature, and therefore on the will of the original creator of our nature. The purpose and the norm of man's dominion over the physical universe stem from the ultimate destiny of human existence, from the law of God, which provides to govern all human actions and activities, as well as from the needs and requirements of human nature. The world must help us to fulfill our human goals fully and completely, both here and insofar as the hereafter is concerned. It is for that end that man may and ought to use the things of this world. Only where and insofar as such use would constitute a hindrance to achieving the aims of life which God intends for us in this world and in the next, is there a serious important obligation incumbent on man to renounce his use of worldly goods. Without the help of the physical universe round about us, we would be deprived of the prerequisite means for and basis of any higher cultural endeavor. In fact, even mere physical existence and survival would become an impossibility for us. Man needs and is dependent on the world. That brings us to the first basic principle of economic life. Our wants force us to economize, and the satisfaction of our wants is the purpose of all economic activity. If our wants demonstrate that we are dependent on the world, they also reveal, on the other hand, the nature and scope of the specific completeness of human nature. The more exalted the species is to which a living being belongs, the more complex it is its vital process, and the more numerous and varied are its needs. Man has more needs than the animal, and the animal has more needs than the plant. Thus we have a proof of the essential superiority of man over the animal and the plant in the fact that he can extend his wants, refine them, and seek ever more suitable means to satisfy them. Therefore, human needs indicate at one and the same time both a weakness in human nature as well as its majesty. Accordingly, the development, enlargement, and refinement of wants cannot be rejected out of hand as morally objectionable. On the contrary, we find that in a completely legitimate and necessary kind of progress. And since we are dealing here with a process which is tied to rational nature that is common to all mankind, we come to the logical conclusion that all men are also called to share in the progress that is made in our material culture in the form of an expanded, which is to say, improved satisfaction of their wants. For that reason, we are in full harmony with Christian ethics if we say that the notion of minimum living standard is not always the same as saying bare subsistence, but that such a living standard already means a level of living which is in accord with human dignity and which corresponds to the kind of higher level of cultural achievement which man may succeed in attaining. And what is more, it means that such an improved standard of living must extend also to the lowest ranks of society to an ever-increasing degree. However, it is necessary to distinguish between wants and mere desires. The pure and simple craving for enjoyment and superficial glitter, taken by itself, is without effective limits and can therefore easily get out of hand. Also, the objective capacity to enjoy does not provide us with satisfactory limits to want satisfaction. Another norm is needed, namely, concern for the higher purpose of human existence, the spiritual moral order, in order to assure that correct choices are made and proper moderation is used on the exercise of practical reason. Albert Schaffel pointed out that it is not an unrestricted increase and variation of wants which the economy must satisfy, and which people ought to be in search of, but an extension of wants in keeping with the needs of an unfolding, richly cultured personality, progressing from the most important to the less important wants, and varying in its content in accord with the norm of an eventual restructuring and development of a personal moral living pattern. A structuring of wants that is economically proper is one which is adapted to a more productive manner to genuine culture. Our economic science has time and again made the mistake of praising any and every expansion of wants. It ought to approve only the kind of want structure which has the most beneficial possible effect on moral foundation, and which is a real blessing for it. Pagan Rome, with its culture perverted by materialism to seeking satisfaction of frivolous desires and pleasures, demonstrates where a culture which holds in contempt all moral limitations will lead. A.V. Gleichmann Russwurm. Pagan Rome, with its culture perverted by materialism to seeking satisfaction of frivolous desires and pleasures, demonstrates where a culture which holds in contempt all moral limitations will lead. A. von Gleichen Russwurm told us that the Romans carried all of what they learned from the Greeks to exorbitant and colossal extremes. They wanted everything that was larger than life, strong, formidable, and beautiful. The elegant Greek baths, which were practical and artistic, but kept within modest dimensions, were transformed into baths with excessive decoration, and the Greek plays were perverted into gladiatorial combat and animal excitement. The refined, dignified, tasteful banquets were turned into sheer gluttony by the kind of monumental insanity of which some well-known anecdotes inform us. Dissolved pearls, dishes of eels which were fattened on human flesh, nightingales and the tongues of peacocks, and all sorts of grotesque excrescences of outsized parvenu fantasy. Infamous monsters like Nero, Commodus, and Heliogabal did not come along as isolated instances in our world. They had kindred spirits who, even if on a lesser scale, have demonstrated such attitudes toward ephemeral and instant riches since the beginning of time. It is not true that luxury among vain and pretentious people rears its head also in our time, along with pampered egoism and the senseless vulgar display of monetary wealth. Are we not once again being treated to the spectacle of how materials and goods which could serve far better purposes are sacrificed for the sake of human vanity and pleasure-seeking? To be sure, in the production of things which satisfy cravings for luxury, some workers do earn a livelihood. But does this justify the kind of luxury which serves opulent sense, pleasures and vain self-exaltation? And does it justify the excessive consumption by the few who enjoy an overabundance of the good things of life? One observes the decorous carriages in Hyde Park, London, and the gold-embroidered parade uniforms of lackeys standing in front of the house of the Lord Mayor, as Velleman said. And one looks at the splendid palaces in the West End and the luxurious embellishments in the private clubs. Then one goes to the East End and is horrified by the number of deaths which occur because of hunger, lack of clothing, filth, and poor housing. There is no doubt that luxury is a relative concept. What still ranks as luxury today could at some later time become a legitimate need. And there is also such a thing as dignified luxury, which is in conformity with a person's station in life. All that corresponds to the ideal quest and the rising needs of a higher culture, which also help toward the beautification, refinement, and ennobling of life, and it affords to society a dignity and glamour which adds flavor to life and society in a legitimate sense. Such luxury has never been condemned by Christian ethics. As St. John Chrysostom pointed out, the simplicity and forbearance among Christians is quite different from that of Diogenes, who went around in rags, lived in a barrel, and aroused the curiosity of many, since he needed next to nothing, and yet was of little help to anyone. Summerlad erred when he said that the supernatural morality of the Fathers and the Scholastics would have led to an acknowledgment of the principle of an absolute absence of wants. No, not every superabundance is superfluous. What Christian ethics condemns is only the kind of luxury which arises from immoderate vanity and unrestrained craving for pleasure, such as accompanies the wasteful destruction of goods, which could and should have been used to satisfy the needs of one's neighbor. The same is true of fashion. We may enjoy making fun of the young and also older ladies who parade up and down our city streets with high heels and crooked hats. Posadowski related that a Chinese lady who saw another lady wearing a different kind of hat would be inclined to throw a stone at her. A European lady in the same situation might ask herself how well that hat would look on her. Even in the latter case, there is a display of human weakness. However, most people have something of a herd mentality, which, as A. Meyer observed correctly, makes them fall victim time and again to the urge to imitate others, especially in this area of luxury and fashion. If the urge to follow fashions is a weakness, fashion in itself has its proper place within certain limits. It represents the need for change and will surface wherever industrial development makes possible the satisfaction of that need. Even valuable jewelry and expensive women's clothing are acceptable so long as they remain within the bounds of morality and of their class and avoid whatever incites to sin. In all such matters, what is to be avoided is excess, extremes, impropriety, and immorality. As Anton Koch pointed out, however, the most effective cure which society ought to develop within itself lies in the preservation of good manners, taken in the right sense as implying good taste and dignified decorum. In other words, what is needed is a refined morality. Christian principles regarding the proper use of temporal goods do not apply only to the individual, but they must be revitalized also in society at large. This means that luxury and all of the excessive demands on life which give rise to it must once again be directed into proper channels. In any case, that will help more than all kinds of laws against luxury, luxury taxes, and prohibitions against the use of certain things.
Thanks for listening to the Trad Dads podcast. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really helps us out.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.